Clara Whitfield tore the letter in half the moment she finished reading it. Right there on the depot platform, wind throwing dust across her boots, strangers watching from the shade of the building behind her. The words were already burned into her mind. Plain, practical, forgettable. That was what James Calloway had written to the agency. That was what he expected to step off the noon stage into Harrow Creek, Wyoming. Her hands stopped shaking. She folded both halves into her coat pocket. She picked up her bag, and she walked directly toward the man standing 30 feet away, whose jaw had gone slack the moment he laid eyes on her. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. James Calloway had not moved. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Most men either stepped forward or stepped back when a woman walked toward them with purpose. James did neither. He stood beside his wagon like a man who'd been turned to stone, dark eyes fixed on her face, one hand resting on the side of the wagon bed, and the other hanging at his side like he'd forgotten it was attached to his body. She stopped 3 feet from him. "Mr. Calloway." "That can't be right." His voice came out rough, like it hadn't been used much lately. "I beg your pardon?" "You can't be—" He stopped, started again. "The agency sent you?" "They did." Clara set her traveling bag down between her feet. "Clara Whitfield, from St. Joseph. I have the correspondence in my bag if you need to verify it." James looked at the bag, looked at her, looked somewhere past her left shoulder like the answer to something might be written on the depot wall. "I wrote specific instructions." "I know what your instructions said, Mr. Calloway." "Then you understand why I'm standing here looking like a man who's just been handed a rattlesnake when he asked for a house cat?" Clara kept her voice level. "Yes, I understand completely." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Something more complicated than that. "I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said." She wasn't angry. She'd read that letter 3 times on the stage, and anger had burned itself out somewhere around the Kansas border. What was left was something cleaner. Resolve. You wanted plain. You wanted simple. You wanted a woman who would keep house and stay quiet, and not complicate your life in any direction. James Calloway's jaw tightened. "That's a harsh way to put it." "Is it inaccurate?" He didn't answer that. The stage driver was unloading her trunk from the back, making a great deal of unnecessary noise in the way men do when they're trying to pretend they aren't listening to every word of a conversation happening 6 feet away. Across the street, 2 women had stopped walking. A man outside the saloon had turned to watch. Clara could feel the weight of the town's attention like a hand on the back of her neck. "There's been a mistake," James said finally. "There hasn't." Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the 2 halves of his letter. She held them together so he could see his own handwriting. "This is your correspondence to the Whitmore Agency dated September 3rd. You requested a wife capable of managing household accounts, preserving food for winter, and basic ranch upkeep. I can do all 3. I've been managing financial records for a law office in St. Joseph for 8 years. I can read a land deed faster than most lawyers, and I can find an error in a column of figures that 3 other people have already missed." She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. "What you cannot specify in a letter, Mr. Calloway, is what a woman looks like. The agency sent me because I was the best match for what you actually need, not for what you think you want." James stared at her for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw worked. "You read my letter." "Obviously." "I mean, you read the whole thing. You know exactly what I said about wanting someone you wouldn't notice?" "Yes." Clara picked up her bag. "Your trunk. If you'd point me toward your wagon." He didn't move. "You ought to be offended." "I probably would be, if I had the luxury." She looked at him directly. He was taller than she'd expected from the photograph the agency had provided. Lean in the way men got after years of hard work, not laziness, with dark eyes that had the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a long time watching things carefully. Former railroad detective, the agency file had said. She'd read that, too. "Mr. Calloway, I came 1,200 miles on a stagecoach. I am not going back. If you want me gone, you'll have to say it plainly. And then you'll have to carry my trunk back to the depot yourself, because I won't do it for you. Otherwise, tell me where your wagon is." James Calloway looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up her trunk, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and said, "This way." She followed him. They loaded her things without speaking. The silence wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that had sharp edges, the kind where both people were thinking things they hadn't yet decided whether to say out loud. Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for him to offer a hand. James climbed up on the other side, took up the reins, and turned the horses toward the road leading out of town. They made it 4 blocks before he said, "Why did you come?" "I told you." "You told me what you could do." "That's not the same thing." He kept his eyes on the road. "Woman who looks like you and works legal documents for 8 years in a city doesn't run out of options. So why the agency? Why Wyoming?" Clara was quiet for a moment. The town of Harrow Creek was small. 1 main street, a bank, a general store, a saloon, a church that needed painting, and a handful of houses spreading out behind like afterthoughts. Nothing like St. Joseph. Nothing like anything she'd known. "Because the man I worked for paid me half what he paid the men doing the same work. And when I told him I'd found the discrepancy in the payroll records, because I was the one keeping the payroll records, he let me go." She watched a hawk cross the sky above them. "I had enough saved for a stage ticket and 3 months of expenses. Not enough to start over in a city. Enough to come here and see if something different was possible." James's hands shifted on the reins. "You found the error in your own payroll." "It wasn't an error. It was deliberate." She looked at him. "There's a difference. Errors are accidental. What my employer did was a choice made over 8 years. I found documentation going back to my first month." She paused. "He burned it before I could take it anywhere useful. But I know what I saw." Something changed in James Calloway's expression. It was small, a slight loosening around the eyes. "How'd you know it wasn't an error?" "Because I know what errors look like. They're inconsistent. They show up in different places, different amounts, different patterns. What he did was precise. Same percentage every month, always in the same column, always written by the same hand." She turned to look at the land opening up around them. Rolling grass, pale sky, mountains in the far distance still carrying snow on their peaks. When something in a ledger is wrong in the same way every single time, someone put it there on purpose. James drove in silence for another half-mile. "What do you actually know about ranching?" "Almost nothing." "That's honest." "You hired me for the books, not the cattle." "I hired you to keep house." "Your letter also mentioned accounts and correspondence, and that you had significant paperwork you'd been avoiding." Clara looked at him steadily. "Which is it, Mr. Calloway? Housekeeper or bookkeeper?" "Both." "Then let's be clear about what both means before we waste each other's time arguing about it." James glanced at her sidelong. Something in his expression that might have been the beginning of respect, or might have been something he wasn't ready to name yet. "Ranch is 3 miles out." "All right, it's not much to look at." "I didn't come for scenery." "House needs work." "Most things do." Another silence. This one slightly less sharp than the last. You always talk this much? James asked. Only when someone needs to hear something. Otherwise, I'm perfectly quiet. She folded her hands in her lap. You'll find I'm practical, Mr. Calloway. Not the kind of practical you were hoping for, I imagine, but the useful kind. He didn't answer, but he also didn't tell her to turn around. The Calloway Ranch sat on a rise above a shallow creek. The main house small and weathered. The barn solid but showing its age. Fencing in various states of repair, running out in all directions. Clara climbed down from the wagon before James could come around to help and stood in the yard, looking at it with the same assessment she'd given everything in her life since she was 16 and had to decide what could be saved and what couldn't. Well, James said, watching her. The house is sound. The barn needs the north wall. Fences can wait until I know what else needs money. She turned. Can I see the books? You just arrived. I know. Can I see the books? Clara, he stopped. Tried again. Miss Whitfield. Mr. Calloway. On the stage, I sat next to a cattle buyer from Cheyenne, who spent 4 hours telling me that Harold Stroud buys every piece of land between here and the Laramie River that he can get his hands on, and that 3 ranches inside of 10 miles have sold to him in the past 18 months. She held his gaze. You've been avoiding your paperwork. You have a neighbor who acquires land aggressively, and a ranch that, by your own admission, is barely keeping itself solvent. I'd like to see your books before something in them surprises you at a moment when you can't afford to be surprised. James went very still. How do you know about Stroud? I told you, cattle buyer on the stage. That's all? That's enough. She waited. The books, Mr. Calloway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked inside and held the door open. The kitchen was what she'd expected. Functional, bare, used by a man who'd given up on the idea of meals being anything other than fuel. The table was clear, except for a stack of papers at one end, loose and unorganized, some of them visibly months old. James pulled a battered ledger from the shelf and set it in front of her without comment. Clara sat down, opened it, and started reading. She was 3 pages in when she heard him put a cup of coffee beside her elbow. She didn't look up. 2 pages later, she found the first problem. She turned back 2 entries, confirmed it, and wrote a note in the margin with a pencil she'd produced from her coat pocket. You're writing in my ledger, James said. I'm noting a discrepancy. That ledger is the payment to Stroud's bank in March. The interest rate listed here is 11%. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. Your original loan agreement. Do you have it? James opened the drawer under the table and pulled out a folded paper. Clara took it, smoothed it open, read it, and set it beside the ledger. The agreement says 8%. Someone changed the rate in the ledger. Either you wrote it wrong, or someone else wrote it. James leaned over to look. His face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. The alertness of a man who'd spent years investigating things, snapping back into place like a gun being cocked. I didn't write that. I know. How do you know? Because the 8 in 8% is written in the same hand as everything else in this ledger. The 11 is written slightly differently. Someone went back to that entry. She pointed to the faint trace of erasure around the figure. You've been overpaying on this loan for at least 6 months, possibly longer. She turned back to the beginning and started going through it again, more carefully. I need an hour. Go do whatever you do in the evening. I'll have a full accounting by the time you're done. James didn't move. How much? I don't know yet. Estimate. I don't estimate. I calculate. She looked up. 1 hour, Mr. Calloway. He stood there another moment. Then he took his hat off the peg by the door, put it back on, and went outside. Clara turned back to the ledger. She found 4 separate discrepancies in the first hour. The altered interest rate. A payment recorded twice in different months for the same amount. The kind of thing that could be innocent clerical error or could be a deliberate double charge. A property tax assessment that was 20% higher than the territorial rate posted in the courthouse records she'd memorized during the legal correspondence she'd handled in St. Joseph. And one entry that stopped her cold. A notation in the back pages, barely legible, in James's own handwriting. Boundary, creek line, original survey 1877. Stone markers. She was reading it for the 3rd time when James came back in. "You found something," he said. He could tell. She hadn't tried to hide it. "Several things. Come sit down." He sat. She laid it all out, one item at a time, pointing to each entry with her pencil, explaining what she'd found and what it meant, in plain language, without softening any of it. James listened without interrupting. His face stayed still, but his hands, resting flat on the table, tightened slightly with each item. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the creak of the house settling. "Stroud," James said finally. "I don't know that yet." "I do." He stood, walked to the window, and stood with his back to her for a moment. "I spent 6 years investigating land fraud for Union Pacific. I know what it looks like. He stopped. "I didn't think I'd have to worry about it again out here." "Why not?" "Because I bought this land clean. Paid cash. No complications." "The land may be clean," Clara said, "but someone has access to your bank records, and someone has been adjusting figures in your favor." She paused. "Not in your favor. In theirs." He turned around. "That notation in the back, the boundary markers. Tell me about them." James came back to the table. "When I bought this property, the surveyor marked the northern boundary along Willow Creek. Stone markers every 100 yards following the creek bed. It matters because the creek bends. It doesn't run straight. If someone were to claim a straight-line boundary instead of following the creek bed, they'd be able to cut off the north pasture." Clara had already seen it. She'd read enough land descriptions in 8 years to picture it. "Approximately how much acreage?" 30, maybe 35. "And those stone markers, are they still there?" "Last time I checked." "When was that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Spring." It was late October. "We should check again," Clara said. "Soon." James looked at her across the table. The lamp between them threw his face half into shadow. Why would they move stone markers when they can just change the figure in a ledger? Because a changed ledger proves one thing. Missing stone markers, combined with a falsified boundary claim, proves something bigger. She folded her hands on the table. "Harold Stroud is a banker and a land agent. He doesn't just want your money, Mr. Calloway. He wants the land. The altered interest rate is pressure, financial pressure, to make you struggle. If you struggle long enough, you sell. If you don't sell, he finds another way. And you know all this from a cattle buyer on a stage. I know it from 8 years of reading documents written by men who thought nobody would ever connect the pieces." Clara met his eyes. "I connect the pieces. It's what I do." The lamp flickered. James Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and Clara could see him making a decision. Something in his face shifting from resistance to something else. Something careful and cautious. But moving in a direction he hadn't expected to move when he'd woken up that morning and driven to meet a plain, forgettable woman who was supposed to make no demands on his attention whatsoever. "You can stay," he said. "I know." You mean you're not going to put me back on the stage?" She closed the ledger. "I understood that when you held the door open." "That's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm saying you can stay and this can be what the agency intended it to be. A working arrangement. Yes. With the understanding that I do the work I'm actually suited for. Yes. Clara stood, picked up the ledger, and set it back on the shelf. Then we start in the morning. I want to ride the north boundary and check those markers before the weather turns. She turned to face him. And I want to see your original loan documents. Everything Stroud's bank has touched. Every piece of paper. That might take some time. I have time. She looked at him steadily. The question is whether you do. Something moved in James Calloway's eyes that had nothing to do with ledgers or stone markers or the cold coming down from the mountains. He looked away first. I'll find the documents tonight. Good. She moved toward the hallway. Which room? Last door on the left. It's not much. Told you, I didn't come for comfort. She was at the door when he said, Miss Whitfield. She stopped. You said someone changed the figure in that ledger. If you're right about Stroud, if he has someone with access to my records, he paused. He's going to know you're here. He's going to know someone's going through the books. Clara turned to look at him over her shoulder. Good, she said. Let him know. Then she went to her room, sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark, pressed both hands flat on her knees, and let herself shake for exactly 2 minutes, because she was terrified and exhausted and 1,200 miles from the only life she'd known, and she had found exactly what she'd feared she'd find in that ledger, and tomorrow was going to be harder than today. 2 minutes. Then she straightened up, unpacked her bag with quiet efficiency, laid her tools on the side table, pencil, ruler, the small leather notebook she'd carried for 8 years, and went to sleep. Outside, in the kitchen, James Calloway sat at the table with a stack of documents he hadn't looked at in months and worked through them one by one, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow and the sound of the wind against the walls, and thought about a woman who'd torn his letter in half before she'd even gotten off the stage, and still walked straight toward him like she had every right to be exactly where she was. He was in trouble. He could feel it already. But for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the kind of trouble that made him want to ride in the opposite direction. James was still at the table when the first light came through the window. He hadn't slept. The documents were spread in front of him in 4 separate groups: original loan agreements, payment receipts, land assessment notices, and a 4th pile he'd made for things he couldn't yet categorize, but that sat wrong in his gut, the way things had always sat wrong in his gut, right before they became serious problems. He heard her door open at 5:30. Clara came into the kitchen, already dressed, hair pinned back, the leather notebook in her hand. She looked at the documents on the table, looked at him, and said nothing about the fact that he'd clearly been there all night. She went to the stove, built up the fire, and put water on without asking whether he wanted coffee. Then she came to the table and stood looking at the 4 piles. You organized them, she said. Seemed useful. It is. She sat down across from him and pulled the nearest pile toward her. Did you find anything? Maybe. James pointed to a receipt near the top of the 2nd pile. Payment from August. Look at the date stamp. Clara picked it up and studied it. This was stamped 3 days after the payment was due, which means, according to Stroud's bank, I paid late, which triggers the late penalty in the loan agreement. She was already reaching for the agreement, which is 3% added to the outstanding balance. He watched her run her pencil down the column of figures. I paid on time. I wrote in myself and handed the cash to the teller. I remember it because it was the same day the Hendersons' barn caught fire and half the town was out there. So there were witnesses to where you were that day? Plenty. Clara set the receipt down and picked up the payment ledger. The date in the ledger matches the stamp on the receipt. Both wrong. Which means whoever changed this had access to both documents. She made a note. This wasn't a teller making an error, Mr. Calloway. Someone went back to this entry deliberately and changed the stamp. Can you prove that? I can show that the ink on the date stamp is slightly different from the ink on the rest of the receipt. Different age, different formulation. It'll take someone with legal authority to compel a proper examination, but yes, I can build the case. She looked up. How many times has this happened? I found 3 receipts that look the same way. Then you've been assessed late penalties at least 3 times that we know of. Each one adding to your balance. Each one making it look like you're a worse financial risk than you are. She was writing quickly. And a worse financial risk means when Stroud eventually makes an offer on this property, he can justify a lower price. You're struggling because he made you struggle. James pushed back from the table and stood. Not from agitation, from the particular restlessness of a man who thinks better on his feet. I left railroad work because I was tired of this, because I thought out here I could just work. Just do the work and not have to... He stopped. Not have to fight, Clara said. Yeah, I understand that. She didn't say it with sympathy. She said it the way she said most things, straight, without decoration. But I think you already knew something was wrong before I arrived. You've been avoiding these documents for months. You don't strike me as a man who avoids things out of laziness. He looked at her. What do I strike you as? A man who investigates things for a living, and knows that once you start pulling a thread, you can't put it back. She set down her pencil. You were hoping it would resolve itself. That's not. It never resolves itself. She stood. Coffee's ready. He poured 2 cups and brought them to the table, and they sat with the documents between them, like a problem they'd both decided, without saying so, that they were going to solve together. The ride to the north boundary happened after breakfast. Eggs Clara found in the coop, and bread she'd put together in 20 minutes from supplies that James had been certain were inadequate for anything involving actual cooking. He didn't say anything about the bread, but he ate 3 pieces of it, and she noticed. The morning was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that came down off the mountains and meant business. Clara rode well enough, which surprised him, though he realized afterward that it shouldn't have. Nothing about her so far had matched what he'd assumed. They rode the boundary in silence for the first quarter mile. The creek ran on their left, low with the dry season but still visible, cutting its uneven path through the grass. James counted the stone markers as they passed. He knew where each one should be. The first gap appeared about halfway along the northern line. He pulled up his horse. Clara stopped beside him. The grass was undisturbed, except for a slight depression in the earth where the stone had been. How long ago? Clara said. Can't say exactly. Weeks, maybe. Ground's still soft where it was. He dismounted, crouched, examined the depression. Pulled out cleanly, not kicked over by an animal. Could it have sunk? Stones don't sink, not like this. He stood. Someone took it. How many more? They rode the rest of the line. 2 more gaps, 3 total, each in the section where the creek curved most sharply away from a straight line. Exactly the section where a falsified straight-line boundary would cut deepest into James's land. Clara had her notebook out before they'd finished turning their horses back toward the house. She was sketching the line, marking the positions of the remaining stones, noting the gaps. James watched her work without speaking. You're mapping it, he said. Someone needs to. She finished the sketch and closed the notebook. If Stroud files a boundary claim using a straight line, your remaining markers prove the creek follows a different path. But 3 missing markers create doubt. His surveyor can argue the creek shifted. The original markers were placed incorrectly. Any number of things. She looked at him. We need to document what's here before anything else goes missing. Or we need to find out where the missing ones went. That too. She tucked the notebook into her coat. Do you know anyone who was present at the original survey? James thought. The surveyor's dead, died 2 years back. But Ruth McAllister was here in '77. She keeps records of everything that happens in this valley. If those markers were placed, she likely wrote it down. Then we go to town. You want to go today? I want to go before Stroud knows we've been on this line. Clara looked at him directly. He has someone watching your bank records. He may have someone watching the property. Every day we wait is a day he can move first. James had spent 6 years working on exactly this kind of problem, and he knew she was right. He also knew that going to town meant going to a place where Harold Stroud did his business, and had his relationships, and had likely already formed an opinion about the woman who'd arrived on yesterday's stage. You understand what walking into Harrow Creek with me looks like, he said. It looks like a man and the woman he's about to marry going to buy supplies and visit an old friend of the family. Clara's voice was entirely calm. Unless you'd prefer I stay here and let you handle it alone. I didn't say that. Then let's go. Ruth McAllister was behind her counter when they walked into the general store, and her expression when she saw Clara was the kind of expression that meant she'd already heard the story of yesterday's arrival, and had formed a positive opinion. She was 67 years old and built like someone who'd decided a long time ago that the world could accommodate her or get out of the way. And she shook Clara's hand with both of hers and said, I heard you tore his letter in half on the platform. I did, Clara said. Good. Ruth looked at James. You always did ask for the wrong thing. James chose not to respond to that. Ruth, the original survey, 77, the northern boundary of my property. Ruth's expression sharpened. She looked between them. Why? Because 3 of the boundary markers are missing, and someone altered my payment records at Stroud's bank. He kept his voice low. The store was empty except for them, but walls in small towns had a way of hearing. I need whatever documentation you have. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the back room without a word and came out carrying a ledger that made Clara's eyes go bright with recognition. August 77, Ruth said, opening it on the counter. I was there when they set those markers. My husband wrote down every position. She turned the ledger toward Clara. Every stone, every coordinate, signed by the original surveyor and witnessed by my husband and Thomas Kerr, who owned the property to the east at the time. Clara was reading before Ruth finished speaking. Her pencil came out. She compared the positions in Ruth's ledger against the sketch in her notebook, checking each one. The 3 missing markers, Clara said, are at positions 7, 12, and 15 in your record. Those are the 3 deepest points of the curve, James said. Yes, Clara looked at Ruth. Would you be willing to provide a certified copy of this record? For legal purposes, if it comes to that. Ruth looked at James. Has Stroud made a move yet? Not officially. He will. Ruth closed the ledger. He's been circling you for 2 years, James. You know that. She looked at Clara. What do you know about Harold Stroud? That he's a banker and land agent who's acquired 6 properties in 18 months and has been manipulating financial records to create pressure on at least one landowner in this valley? Clara paused. And that whatever he's building, he's in a hurry. Men who move carefully don't forge date stamps on payment receipts. They don't pull boundary markers in the middle of the night. They move carefully when they have time. They get reckless when they don't. Ruth McAllister studied Clara for a long moment. Then she said, "Where did James find you?" "Agency in St. Joseph." "Best thing he ever did." Ruth tucked the ledger under her arm. "I'll have a certified copy ready by tomorrow morning, and I'll write a statement about being present at the survey. My husband's gone, God rest him, but Thomas Kerr's son still lives on his father's old property. He was there as a boy. He remembers." They were almost out the door when Harold Stroud walked in. He was not what Clara had pictured from the cattle buyer's description on the stage, which meant she'd pictured him correctly in every way that mattered, and incorrectly in the details. He was not physically imposing. He was 52, well-dressed, with a particular kind of surface pleasantness that men in his position wore the way other men wore suits. Carefully chosen, fitted for effect. His eyes, when they found James, were cordial. When they moved to Clara, they stayed cordial, in a way that was its own kind of assessment. "James," he said, "heard you had a visitor arrive yesterday." "Miss Whitfield." James's voice was flat. "My fiancée." Clara didn't react to the word. She simply looked at Harold Stroud and waited. "Miss Whitfield," Stroud's smile arrived. "Welcome to Harrow Creek. I hope James has been making you feel at home." "He has," Clara said. "We've been settling in, going through the ranch accounts, getting organized before winter." Something very small happened in Stroud's eyes, too small for most people to catch. Clara caught it. "Wonderful. Always good to have someone to help with the paperwork." He looked at James. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to come out and discuss your loan situation. Some adjustments I think would benefit you." "What adjustments?" James said. "Nothing to worry about. Just some housekeeping." Stroud glanced at Clara. "Banker's business. Might be easier to discuss in private." "Miss Whitfield manages my accounts," James said. "Anything you have to say about my finances, you can say to both of us." The pleasantness in Stroud's face stayed perfectly in place, but something underneath it adjusted, the way a man adjusts his weight when the ground shifts slightly under his feet. "Of course. Well, perhaps later this week, when you've both had time to settle." "We'll come to the bank Thursday morning," Clara said. 9 o'clock. It wasn't a question. Stroud's smile didn't falter, but it didn't reach anything behind his eyes. "I'll look forward to it." They said their goodbyes and walked out, and Clara kept her pace even and her expression neutral until they were back at the wagon and moving down the street. "He knows we've been in the ledger," James said quietly. "He knew the moment we walked into Ruth's store. Someone told him." She looked straight ahead. "He's going to spend the next 3 days preparing for Thursday. Moving things, adjusting records, finding explanations." "So we don't wait until Thursday?" "No." She turned to look at him. "We go tomorrow. Early, before he's ready." James was quiet for a moment. "You know when I said you were nothing like what I asked for?" "Yes." "I'm starting to think I didn't know what I was asking for." Clara looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Then she turned back to the road ahead. "Nobody ever does," she said. "That's usually the problem." They ate dinner that night with a document spread across the kitchen table between them, talking through what they had and what they still needed, and what their best approach was for walking into Harold Stroud's bank with enough evidence to make him understand that the pressure campaign he'd been running quietly for 2 years had just encountered an obstacle he hadn't planned for. James had spent 6 years doing exactly this kind of work, but he'd done it for other people, for a company, with a team behind him and legal authority he could invoke. Doing it for himself was different. It was personal in a way that made him move slower, think less clearly, feel the edges of everything too sharply. Clara didn't have that problem. She moved through the documentation with the same efficiency she brought to everything. But James had started to notice something underneath the efficiency. A fury, quiet and controlled, that came from 8 years of watching men profit from things she'd built and maintain, while they smiled at her and told her she was very capable for a woman. She wasn't fighting just for his land. She was fighting for the principle of the thing, for the satisfaction of watching a falsified record get dismantled piece by piece in the clear light of day. He understood that. He understood it better than he wanted to. "The interest rate discrepancy," Clara said, turning the ledger toward him. "Combined with the false late penalties, Stroud's bank has overcharged you approximately $460. James stared at the figure. $460 was the difference between a hard winter and an impossible one. It was fence posts and feed and a new barn wall, and the margin between keeping the herd and selling half of it at a loss. "He's been bleeding you," Clara said. "Slowly enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking directly at it. Slowly enough that by spring you'd be far enough in the hole that selling would start to look like relief instead of defeat. And now we walk into his bank tomorrow morning with Ruth's records and a documented accounting of every alteration made to your payment history. And we give Harold Stroud the choice of returning what he took or explaining to the territorial marshal why the figures in his bank's ledger don't match the original loan agreement he signed." She closed the notebook. "He won't want that conversation. Men like Stroud depend on the appearance of legitimacy. The moment that appearance cracks, his other arrangements start looking different too." James turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You're not scared." "I'm terrified," she said simply. "But being scared doesn't change what needs to be done." He looked at her. The lamp between them threw light across her face, and he thought about the woman he'd stood waiting for on that platform yesterday morning, and the gap between what he'd expected and what had arrived, and how that gap had turned out to be the most important thing that had happened to him in 3 years without him knowing it until now. "Why did you fold the letter back together?" he said, "before you came toward me? I watched you tear it, and then you folded it back." Clara was quiet for a moment. "So I'd have it, in case you denied writing it." "That's all?" She looked at him steadily. "That's all, Mr. Calloway." But they both knew it wasn't, and neither of them said so, and the lamp burned low between them, and outside the Wyoming wind came down off the mountains and pressed against the walls of the house like it was testing whether they'd hold. They held. They left before dawn. James had the horses ready at 4:30, and Clara was at the door at 4:25 with her leather satchel over one shoulder and Ruth McAllister's certified copy folded inside her coat next to her own documented accounting of every discrepancy she'd found in James's records. She'd been up since 3. He could tell by the way the lamp in the kitchen had already been burning when he came out of his room, and by the way she'd moved through the morning with a particular quietness of someone who'd already fought their first battle of the day inside their own head and won it. Neither of them spoke much on the ride in. The valley was dark and cold and still, the kind of still that happened before the world remembered it was supposed to keep moving. James rode with his rifle across his saddle, not because he expected trouble on the road, but because some habits from 6 years of railroad investigation didn't leave a man just because he'd tried to leave them. He watched Clara from the corner of his eye. She rode straight-backed, the satchel across her body, her eyes forward. She was afraid. He'd learned in the past 2 days to read the small signs of it, the way her hands were slightly too still when she was thinking through something difficult, the way she breathed a little more carefully when the stakes of a thing settled fully on her. She was afraid, and she was going anyway, and she'd been doing that her whole life, he suspected, and he had no idea what to do with the feeling that gave him. Harrow Creek woke up slowly. The mercantile was just opening, smoke beginning from the chimneys, a dog crossing the empty Main Street at its own unhurried pace. Stroud's Bank didn't open until 8 o'clock. It was 7:20. "We wait," James said. "We don't wait on the street." Clara was already moving toward Ruth's store. "Come on." Ruth was expecting them. She had coffee and a look on her face that said she hadn't slept much either. Thomas Kerr's son, a broad-shouldered man of 40 named Daniel, was sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with his hat in his hands. He stood when they came in. "Daniel," James said. "James." Daniel shook his hand. Then he looked at Clara. "Ruth said you needed a statement about the 77 survey." "I do." Clara sat down across from him and opened her notebook. "Tell me everything you remember." Daniel Kerr was not a complicated man, but he was a precise one. The kind of man who remembered things the way farmers remembered seasons, in sequence, in detail, in the order they mattered. He told Clara about the August afternoon when he'd been 12 years old and watched his father and James's father and a surveyor named Elias Greer walk the boundary line with measuring chains and wooden stakes, setting the stone markers one by one along the creek bed. He remembered the creek being high that year from a wet summer. He remembered that the surveyor had argued with his father about one of the positions before they agreed. He remembered that each marker had been scratched with a chisel mark, 2 parallel lines, so they could be identified. Clara wrote all of it down. Then she said, "The chisel marks. Did you see them on the existing markers when you last passed that line?" Daniel thought. "2 of the ones I passed last spring, yeah. Couldn't say I looked at all of them." "We need to check the remaining markers today, before we go to the bank." Clara looked at James. "If the marks are there, it confirms authenticity." "If any of the remaining markers have been replaced with unmarked stones," James said, "then we know exactly how far this has gone." She stood. "Can you ride with us, Daniel?" Daniel looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded. He put his hat back on. "Let's go." They rode out to the north boundary as the sun came fully up, and Clara went to each remaining marker on foot, crouching to examine the surface of each stone, while James and Daniel watched from horseback. She moved methodically, quickly, with the precision of someone who'd spent years examining documents for marks that weren't supposed to be there, and marks that were supposed to be there and weren't. She stopped at the 11th marker, crouched down, was still for a moment. "James?" He dismounted and came to her. She pointed. The stone was the right size, the right shape, the right color. But its surface was clean, no chisel marks. "Someone replaced it," she said. "Recently." James crouched beside her. The earth around the base of the stone was slightly looser than around the others. "Within the last month, I'd say." "So not just removing them, replacing some with unmarked stones to make it look like the line is still intact." Clara stood, and James saw something move through her face. Not fear this time, but anger. The contained kind. The kind that made people more dangerous rather than less. "He's been planning this for a long time." "Long enough to be careful." "Not careful enough." She turned back to her notebook. The marked stones confirm the creek boundary. The replaced stone confirms deliberate tampering. Daniel's testimony confirms the original markers were chiseled. Ruth's record provides the coordinates. She looked at James. "We have enough." They rode back to town in a different kind of silence than the morning one. This silence had weight to it, the weight of something about to happen that couldn't be undone after. Stroud's Bank was open when they arrived. James tied the horses outside and held the door for Clara, and she walked in the way she walked everywhere, directly, without hesitation, like she'd decided before she got there that she had every right to be in the room. Harold Stroud was at his desk in the back office, visible through the open door. He looked up when they came in. His expression did exactly what Clara had predicted it would do. It assembled itself into pleasantness so quickly that anyone not watching for it would have missed the half-second before. The half-second of calculation. "James, Miss Whitfield." He stood. "I wasn't expecting you until Thursday." "We had some time this morning," Clara said. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. They sat. Stroud sat across from them and folded his hands on the desk and waited with the patience of a man who believed he had more information than the people sitting across from him. Clara opened her satchel and placed 5 documents on the desk in a precise line. The original loan agreement. 3 payment receipts with the falsified date stamps. Her documented accounting. Then, last, Ruth McAllister's certified record of the 1877 boundary survey with Daniel Kerr's signed statement attached. Stroud looked at the documents. He did not touch them. "The loan agreement specifies an interest rate of 8%, Clara said. "Your bank's ledger records 11%, beginning with the payment cycle of April of this year. The discrepancy amounts to an overcharge of $230 across 6 months." She pointed to the receipts. These 3 payment receipts carry date stamps that conflict with the bank's own internal records and with the testimony of multiple witnesses who can confirm Mr. Calloway was in Harrow Creek on the correct date for each of these payments. The false late stamps generated penalty charges of an additional $230. She folded her hands. $460 total, Mr. Stroud. Taken from Mr. Calloway's account through deliberate falsification of records. Stroud's expression had not changed. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Whitfield." "They're documented facts." "Clerical errors can—" "These aren't clerical errors." Her voice stayed even. "Clerical errors are inconsistent. These alterations follow a pattern. Same method, same column, same hand. I've been reading financial records for 8 years. I know the difference." She gestured to Ruth's document. "This is a certified record of the original 1877 boundary survey of Mr. Calloway's northern property line, witnessed and signed at the time of placement, confirming that the boundary follows Willow Creek. This morning, we confirmed that 3 of the original chiseled boundary markers have been removed, and 1 has been replaced with an unmarked stone." She paused. "If you intend to file a boundary claim using a straight-line survey, you will be filing it against a documented creek bed boundary supported by 3 independent witnesses, physical evidence, and territorial records." The office was quiet. Somewhere in the front of the bank a clock ticked. A horse went past outside. Harold Stroud looked at James. "You brought an accountant to threaten me." "She's my fiancée," James said, "and she's not threatening you. She's giving you the facts. These facts, as you call them, could be disputed." "By whom?" Clara's voice cut clean and flat. "By the teller who changed the date stamps? By the men who pulled the boundary markers? Because those are the people you'd need to produce, Mr. Stroud. And when you produce them, they're going to have to explain, under oath, who told them to do it." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Or you can return the $460 you overcharged, void the manufactured penalties, and cease any boundary proceedings against this property. And this conversation stays in this room." Stroud looked at the documents again. This time he picked one up. He held it with the careful neutrality of a man assessing how much damage it could do. And Clara watched him do it and did not look away. "The agency sent you from St. Joseph," he said finally. "That's right." You worked legal correspondence. For 8 years. Stroud set the receipt down. You understand that making accusations of this nature against a bank officer could have consequences for a woman in your position. New to the territory. No established. I have Ruth McAllister's certified record, Clara said. Daniel Kerr's signed statement. A documented accounting of $460 in falsified charges with the original documents for comparison. And a former railroad detective sitting next to me, who spent 6 years building exactly this kind of evidentiary case for Union Pacific. She met Stroud's eyes. What I don't have is any reason to be afraid of you, Mr. Stroud, because everything you've done is written down, and everything written down can be read by someone who knows how. Something shifted in Harold Stroud's face. Not dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But the pleasantness thinned, the way ice thins in late February before it breaks. And underneath it was something colder and harder, and, Clara noted with quiet satisfaction, frightened. He opened his desk drawer and produced a bank draft book. James put his hand on Clara's arm. Not a restraining gesture, just contact. She felt the weight of it and kept her eyes on Stroud. The banker wrote the draft in silence, tore it free, and placed it on top of the documents. $460. Clara picked it up, examined it, folded it, and placed it in her satchel. The boundary proceedings, she said. There are no proceedings to cease, Stroud said. His voice had gone flat. I haven't filed anything. Then there's nothing to file, Clara stood. We'll expect the adjustment to reflect in Mr. Calloway's account balance by end of business today. Stroud didn't answer that. He was looking at James with the expression of a man recalculating something. You should keep better track of your affairs, James. I've started, James said. He stood, put on his hat, and followed Clara out. They didn't speak until they were back on their horses and moving down the main street. And even then it was James who spoke first. And what he said was not what Clara expected. Are you all right? She looked at him. Yes. Why? Because that was... He paused. You went in there with 4 documents and a pencil, and you took apart everything he built in 20 minutes. 14 minutes, Clara said. I counted. She exhaled. It came out slightly unsteady, and she let it be unsteady, because they were past the bank now, and Stroud couldn't see her, and James already knew she was afraid. He'll retaliate. I know. That was too easy. Men like Stroud don't pay $460 and go back to their business. He paid because he needed us out of his office before we started asking questions he wasn't ready for. She looked at James. There's something else. Something bigger than the boundary markers and the interest rate. The hurry, James said. Yes. Whatever he needs this land for, the deadline is real. He paid us today because fighting us now costs him more time than money. She looked straight ahead. Which means we have a window, a short one. To find out what the deadline is. To find out what he owes and to whom. She looked at him. You still have contacts from your railroad days? Some. Union Pacific would have records of any land contracts in this corridor. Any agreements to sell right-of-way or grazing access or... She stopped. Does the railroad come through here? James was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of a man who just understood something he should have understood sooner. The northern route. They've been surveying a northern route through the territory for 3 years. My land sits right across it. Your land and the Carson property, and 2 of the other ranches Stroud's bought. Clara turned to look at him fully. He's assembling a corridor. He has a contract with the railroad, and he needs every piece of land in the line before the survey is finalized. That's the deadline. When's the survey? I don't know yet, but your railroad contacts might. James pulled up his horse in front of the telegraph office. He went inside, and Clara waited, and she sat with her hand on the satchel and thought about her father, about the way a forged document had taken everything he'd built, and how he died knowing the man who'd done it had never been. Years of watching numbers move in columns and learning to see the hands that moved them. She thought about the cattle buyer on the stage who'd mentioned Stroud's name like a warning, and whether that had been accident or something else. James came back out. Sent a wire to a man I know in Cheyenne, Railroad Procurement Office. He owes me. He remounted. We'll have an answer by tomorrow. They rode out of town with the bank draft in Clara's satchel and $460 of justice that didn't yet feel like enough. And Ruth McAllister watched them go from her doorway and allowed herself a small, grim smile, and went back inside to make a note in her ledger. That evening, James found Clara at the kitchen table, with her notebook open to a fresh page, writing in her precise hand, and the entries she was making were not accounting figures. They were names. Every property sale Stroud had made in the valley in the past 2 years, reconstructed from memory and from things Ruth had said and things Daniel Kerr had mentioned, assembled into a map of what Stroud was building. James sat down across from her. He didn't ask what she was doing. He watched her write for a while, the scratch of the pencil and the pop of the fire, the only sounds in the room. "The night I arrived," Clara said, without looking up, "you told me I could stay, and this could be what the agency intended, a working arrangement." "I remember." "Is that still what this is?" He was quiet. She stopped writing and looked up and met his eyes, and there was nothing guarded in the way she did it. None of the careful neutrality she brought to everything else. Just a straight question from a woman who'd spent 8 years in a city full of men who'd looked at her and seen everything except what she actually was, and who had ridden 1,200 miles on the chance that somewhere in Wyoming there was a man capable of seeing differently. "No," James said. "It isn't." Clara held his gaze. "Then what is it?" "I don't know yet." He said it the way he said most things, flat and honest, without softening. "But it's something I haven't felt in 3 years, and it scares me. And I'm telling you that because you told me yesterday that nobody knows what they're actually asking for." "I said that about the agency." "I know what you said it about." Something changed in Clara's face. Not much, but enough. She looked back down at her notebook. "I scared him today," she said. "Stroud. Not because of the documents. Because he didn't know I existed until I walked through his door. And by the time he understood what I was, it was too late to prepare." "That's going to make him dangerous." "I know." She turned to a new page. "So we move faster than he does." She looked at James again, and this time, when she looked at him, she let him see all of it. The fear and the fury and the exhaustion, and something else underneath all of it. Something that had been growing quietly since a man had held a door open for her when he could have let it close. "Together," she said. James Calloway reached across the table and put his hand over hers on the notebook, and left it there. "Together," he said. Outside, the Wyoming wind pressed against the walls of the house, and inside, 2 people sat with a map of their enemy's ambitions between them, and the knowledge that tomorrow the telegraph would bring an answer that would change everything. And neither of them moved to pull away. The telegraph response came the next morning at 7:42. James was at the depot when the operator finished writing it out, and he read it standing at the counter without moving for a full 30 seconds. Then he folded it into his coat pocket, walked back to where Clara was waiting with the horses outside, and said, "Get on. We need to talk at the house." She read his face and didn't ask questions. They rode back in the kind of silence that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the speed at which a man processes information that confirms his worst assessment of a situation. Inside, he put the telegram on the table in front of her. It was from his contact in the Union Pacific Procurement Office in Cheyenne. 4 lines. The Northern Survey route had been finalized in September, 2 months ago. A land corridor contract had been signed with a private acquisition agent for the Wyoming Territory section. The agent's name was not listed in the wire, but the contract required delivery of clear title to all parcels in the corridor by the 1st of December. The compensation to the acquisition agent upon delivery was listed as $60,000. December 1st was 31 days away. Clara read it twice, set it down, picked up her pencil, and did not write anything with it, just held it. $60,000, she said, against which he owes 40 minimum, based on what Ruth told us about his investment losses. James sat down. He clears $20,000 if he delivers. He loses everything if he doesn't. How many parcels does he still need? The wire doesn't say, but from the map we built last night. James pulled Clara's notebook toward him and looked at the list of names. He has 4 of the 6 properties in the corridor. Mine and 1 other are the gaps. Who's the other? Frank Alderman, East Side. Smaller spread, older man, been here since '64. James's jaw tightened. Frank's been sick. Stroud's probably been working him separately. We need to talk to Frank Alderman today. I know. Clara stood and walked to the window and stood with her back to him, and James watched her think the way he'd been watching her for 3 days now. The slight movement of her fingers against the pencil, the stillness that meant her mind was moving fast behind it. He paid us yesterday, she said. $460. That's not the action of a man who's backing down. That's the action of a man buying time. What's he doing with the time? She turned around. Finding another way to get the land. She met his eyes. He can't falsify records anymore. We have copies of everything, and he knows it. He can't pull the boundary claim. We have Ruth's survey documentation. So he goes around all of it. She came back to the table. He files a legitimate foreclosure if he can manufacture enough of a payment default. Not falsified this time, but real. A legal proceeding that takes months to fight. Months you don't have because winter is coming, and you're already stretched. He forces a sale under duress. At his price, with his timeline. She sat down. He needs to move in the next 2 weeks, before you can stabilize your finances for winter, before you have time to contest anything through proper channels. James was quiet for a moment. What stops him? Proof that the corridor contract exists, and that he's the acquisition agent. Clara tapped the telegram. This wire names Union Pacific and a contract, but not him by name. We need his name on that contract. If we can document that Stroud has a personal financial interest in acquiring your land, that he's not acting as a neutral banker, but as a party to the transaction, every legal action he takes against you is compromised. A judge would see it as conflict of interest at minimum, fraud at maximum. How do we get his name on the contract? Union Pacific keeps copies of all acquisition agreements at their regional office in Cheyenne. Your contact sent you this wire. Can he pull the actual contract document? Maybe, if I ask the right way. Ask the right way. James looked at her. 3 days. She'd been here 3 days, and she'd found what he'd missed for 6 months. And walked into Harold Stroud's bank and taken $460 back from him, and mapped his entire scheme on a single page of a leather notebook she'd brought from St. Joseph in a bag she'd packed for a life she didn't yet know if she'd have. He thought about the letter he'd sent to the agency, about the specific, careful language he'd used to describe exactly what he did not want. And he thought that a man who spent 6 years investigating fraud for a living had no business being surprised that the universe had sent him the one person most qualified to dismantle the thing being done to him. "I'll send the wire," he said. He went to the depot alone because Clara had something else she needed to do. She rode to Frank Alderman's property on the east side of the valley while James was at the telegraph office, and what she found there made her ride back faster than she'd ridden out. Frank Alderman had already signed. He was 71 years old and had been coughing through a chest illness since September, and Stroud had come to him 3 weeks ago with a sale agreement that Frank's arthritic hands had signed because Stroud had told him it was a preliminary assessment form for tax purposes, and Frank's eyesight was bad enough that he hadn't read it closely enough to know the difference between an assessment form and a deed transfer. Frank told Clara all of this sitting in his kitchen while his daughter poured coffee with shaking hands, and explained that her father had realized what he'd signed only when Stroud's man had come to survey the property last week. "He didn't know," the daughter said. "He would never have. This land has been in our family since '64. "I know," Clara said. "Can I see the document he signed?" They had a copy. Stroud had been careful enough to leave one, probably because a man who didn't leave a copy looked suspicious, and Stroud was very good at not looking suspicious. Clara read it at Frank's kitchen table with the same precision she brought to everything, and she found what she was looking for on the second page. The consideration listed for the transfer of Frank Alderman's property was $400. His property was worth 8 times that at minimum. "This is not a valid sale," Clara said carefully, keeping her voice level for Frank's sake. "A contract signed under misrepresentation, where one party was told it was one type of document when it was another, is voidable. That means your father has grounds to have this set aside." The daughter looked up. "You can do that?" "Not alone. You'd need a lawyer, but I can document what happened here, and I can tell you that you're not the only one Stroud has done this to, and that there are other people in this valley who are going to be standing up to him very soon." Clara looked at Frank. "I need your daughter's account of what Stroud told you when he presented this document, in writing, signed and dated." Frank Alderman looked at her with the tired eyes of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for 3 weeks, and was only now being told he might be allowed to put it down. "Who are you again?" "Clara Whitfield. I'm James Calloway's fiancée." "James sent you." "James doesn't know I'm here yet." She met his eyes. "But he will." She had the signed statement in her satchel, and was back on the road to the Calloway Ranch within the hour. James was already back from the depot when she arrived, and he came out of the barn when he heard her horse and read her face before she dismounted. "What happened?" She told him, all of it, straight through, while she tied her horse and walked with him into the kitchen. When she finished, James sat down heavily in the chair he'd been sitting in for 2 nights with documents, and said nothing for a long moment. "Frank signed a deed transfer, thinking it was an assessment form," he said. "Yes. So Stroud already has 5 of the 6 parcels, legally questionable on at least one of them. Possibly more if the other 3 sales have similar irregularities." Clara opened her satchel. "But here's what matters right now. Stroud needs your land to complete the corridor. He has 31 days. Frank's property gives him 5 of 6, but the railroad contract requires all 6 or the deal collapses." She put Frank's daughter's statement on the table. "He will come for you this week." "With what?" "I don't know yet. But he already paid you $460 to buy time. And he didn't do that to walk away." She looked at James. "He's going to find something, or manufacture something, and it's going to be legal enough that fighting it takes time you don't have." James picked up the statement and read it. His face stayed still, but his hands were not entirely steady, and Clara noticed, and said nothing about it, because they were things a person needed to feel without being observed feeling them. What do? We wait for your contact's reply about the acquisition contract. If we can get Stroud's name on that railroad agreement, we have proof of conflict of interest in every transaction he's made in this corridor. She sat down. And we go to the territorial marshal. Wade. Sheriff Wade. Not the sheriff, the marshal. This is beyond a local sheriff. We're talking about a pattern of fraud across multiple properties. A forged deed in Frank Alderman's case. Falsified bank records. That's federal territory. She looked at him steadily. Do you know the territorial marshal? By reputation. Harlan Cross, based in Cheyenne. James set the statement down. Good man. Thorough. Then we write him a letter today. Everything we have, documented. We don't wait for Stroud to move first. If we go to the marshal and it doesn't hold, it holds. Clara's voice was quiet, but had iron in it. James, I have spent 8 years watching men get away with exactly this because the people they did it to didn't have documentation. We have documentation. We have a falsified interest rate with original documents for comparison. We have 3 payment receipts with altered date stamps and witnesses to the correct payment dates. We have a boundary survey record and physical evidence of marker tampering. We have a fraudulent deed transfer with a witness statement. And we're waiting on acquisition contract documentation that will tie all of it together. She put both hands flat on the table. He doesn't have a way through this. He has a way around it, which is why he's going to try to move fast and legally before we can get the documentation to the right people. So we move faster. James looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, When did you learn to do this? I told you. 8 years in a law office. Not the documents. This. He gestured, not at the papers, but at her. The way you move. The way you think through a problem without... He stopped. Without flinching. Clara was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. The fire made its small domestic sounds. My father lost everything to a forged contract, she said. I was 16. I watched him try to fight it without the right documentation and the right people, and he couldn't. He died 2 years later. She looked at the papers on the table. I promised myself I would learn how these things worked, so that when it happened again, to me or to someone near me, I would know exactly what to do. She paused. It took 1,200 miles to find the situation worth using it. James didn't say anything. He looked at her with the expression of a man understanding something about a person that changes the shape of everything he thought he knew. And Clara let him look, because she was tired of being strategic and careful about what she showed and what she didn't. She'd been doing that for 8 years, and she was tired. Write the letter to Marshal Cross, she said. I'll help you draft it. They worked on it for 2 hours. James wrote with the precision of a man who'd filed investigation reports for 6 years. And Clara read every paragraph and tightened what needed tightening, and added the specific legal language that made the difference between a complaint and a case. By 4 in the afternoon, they had 4 pages of documented allegations, with every piece of supporting evidence listed and cross-referenced, ready to go out on the evening stage. They were sealing the envelope when hoofbeats came into the yard. James was at the window before Clara had looked up. 2 riders. She came to stand beside him and looked out, and one of the riders she recognized as the man who worked the front desk at Stroud's Bank, and the other she didn't recognize, but who had the particular quality of stillness in the saddle that meant either law or trouble. Stay here, James said. No. She was already reaching for her coat. He looked at her. Clara, you go out there alone, and whatever they say, you're alone. You go out with me, and you have a witness. She held his gaze. I'm not staying inside. He put on his hat and held the door. The man she didn't recognize spoke first. He had papers in his hand. "James Calloway." "That's right. I'm Silas Pruitt. I represent Harold Stroud in matters of property and finance." He held out the papers. "Mr. Stroud is initiating foreclosure proceedings on this property. Mr. Calloway, you are in default on your loan agreement to the amount of—" "He is not in default," Clara said. Pruitt looked at her. "Ma'am, this is a legal proceeding, which requires accurate figures." She stepped forward and took the papers from his hand before he'd fully extended them. He blinked. She opened them and read, standing in the yard with the cold coming down and both men on horseback watching her. She read the first page and then the second, and when she looked up, her expression was absolutely level. "These proceedings cite an outstanding balance, including the penalty charges that were repaid to Mr. Calloway in full yesterday morning, by bank draft from Harold Stroud himself." She turned the papers so the bank teller could see his employer's signature on the document. This man was present when the draft was written. He witnessed the transaction. She looked at Pruitt. "These proceedings are based on a debt that no longer exists as of yesterday morning. Filing them is either an error or deliberate misrepresentation to a court. Which is it?" Pruitt looked at the teller. The teller looked at the papers. Something moved through the teller's face that was not comfortable. "I wasn't informed of any settlement," Pruitt said carefully. "Then you weren't fully briefed by your client." Clara handed the papers back to him. "I'd suggest you return to Mr. Stroud and ask him to explain the bank draft he wrote yesterday morning before you file anything. Because if you file a foreclosure based on a debt that was settled the day before the filing, the first thing a judge is going to ask is whether Harold Stroud knew about that settlement when he instructed you to proceed." She met Pruitt's eyes. "And the answer to that question opens a conversation neither of you wants to have in front of a judge." Pruitt held the papers, looked at them, looked at Clara, looked at the teller, who was now studying his horse's ears with great concentration. "I'll need to consult with my client," Pruitt said. "Of course." Clara's voice was entirely cordial. "We'll be here." The two men rode out. James watched them go. He didn't move for a moment after they'd cleared the gate, and when he finally turned to look at Clara, she was folding her coat against the cold with steady hands and an expression that was somewhere between furious and exhausted. "He moved faster than we thought," James said. "He's desperate." She looked up. "Pruitt didn't know about the settlement, which means Stroud sent him out here without telling him we'd already resolved the debt. He wanted to see if we'd fold before we had time to respond." Her jaw tightened. "He was testing us." "And now he knows we're not going to fold." "Yes." She looked toward the gate where the riders had gone. "Which means the next thing he tries won't be a test." James put his hand on her shoulder. She went still under the contact, not pulling away, just still, the way she went still when something surprised her by being exactly what she needed. He felt it and left his hand where it was. "The letter goes out tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. "And tomorrow we ride to Frank Alderman's together. Whatever Stroud told his other sellers, I want to know. If there are more Franks, more people who sign things they didn't understand, that's part of the case." Clara turned to look at him, and he was close enough that she had to look up slightly, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "You know what happens if this works," she said. "If Marshall Cross comes, and Stroud's contract is voided, and the corridor falls apart, Stroud loses everything. Men who lose everything don't always go quietly." "I know." "I need you to understand what you're choosing." "Clara, His voice was quiet. "I spent 6 years investigating men like Stroud for a company that turned out to be doing the same thing to other people. I left because I thought I could find a piece of land and just be left alone." His hand was still on her shoulder. "I was wrong about that. You can't buy peace from men who want what you have. You can only hold what's yours." He met her eyes. "I'm done trying to be left alone." She looked at him for a long moment, and what moved through her face was complex and real, and not anything she tried to manage or contain. And James Calloway watched it happen, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 years, and this time did not try to name it something smaller than it was. "Then get the letter," she said. "I'll get the horses." The evening stage left Harrow Creek at 6. They were at the depot at 5:45, and James handed the sealed letter, addressed to Marshal Harlan Cross in Cheyenne, to the driver personally, and stood watching until the stage was out of sight. On the ride home, Clara said, "James." "Yeah?" "When this is over—" She stopped. "When this is over," he said, "we're going to have a conversation that isn't about Harold Stroud." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like that." They rode the rest of the way home in the dark, and the stars came out above the Wyoming Valley one by one, cold and clear and indifferent to the particular gravity of two people deciding, without saying it in so many words, that they had something worth protecting that had nothing to do with land or documents or $60,000, and everything to do with the fact that neither of them had expected to find the other, and both of them had anyway. Inside, Clara rebuilt the fire, and James checked the doors and windows with the careful habit of a man who'd stopped pretending the threat was theoretical. And when they finally sat down at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee between them, the letter was gone, and the case was moving, and Harold Stroud had 30 days left on his deadline, and considerably less than that before everything he'd built came apart in the hands of a woman with a pencil and 8 years of practice finding the things that weren't supposed to be found. Neither of them slept well, but they were both still there in the morning, and that, Clara had learned, was the only promise that actually meant anything. Marshal Harlan Cross arrived on the Thursday stage 8 days after they'd sent the letter. Clara was in the yard, splitting kindling when the rider came up the road, and she knew before he'd dismounted that this was not a man who made social calls. He was 60, lean, with the unhurried movement of someone who'd spent decades arriving at places where people were not entirely glad to see him, and had made peace with that fact long ago. He had a federal marshal's badge on his coat and a leather satchel under his arm that looked very much like the kind a man brought when he intended to stay long enough to read things carefully. He looked at Clara, looked at the axe in her hand. "Miss Whitfield." "Marshal Cross." She set the axe down. "Come inside. James is in the barn. I'll get him." She didn't go get James. She went to the door of the barn and said, "Cross is here," and James came out with his hat already in his hand, which meant he'd been watching the road from the barn window, the same way she'd been watching it from the yard. And they'd both been doing that for 8 days without saying so to each other. They sat at the kitchen table, all three of them, and Cross read every document Clara had assembled without speaking. He read the way experienced men read, not quickly, not slowly, but with a particular attention that meant every line registered and was being filed somewhere useful. He asked 2 questions during the entire reading. The first was about the date discrepancy on the payment receipts. The second was about Daniel Kerr's statement regarding the chiseled boundary markers. When he finished, he closed the last document and folded his hands on top of the stack. "I've been watching Harold Stroud for 14 months, he said. James went very still. Clara kept her face neutral. He came to my attention when a rancher outside Laramie filed a complaint about falsified loan documents 18 months ago. By the time I had enough to move on, Stroud had bought the man's property through a forced sale, and the complainant had left the territory. Cross looked at the documents. I knew he was operating a corridor scheme. I didn't have his name on the railroad contract. He looked at Clara. Your contact in Cheyenne came through this morning. Wire was waiting for me at the depot. He reached into his satchel and produced a folded document. Acquisition contract, Union Pacific Northern Survey Route, Wyoming Territory Section. Agent of record, Harold Stroud, doing business as Western Territory Land Associates. He placed it on the table. Signed September 14th. $60,000 upon delivery of clear title to all 6 parcels in the corridor by December 1st. Clara looked at James. James looked at the contract. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Frank Alderman's deed transfer, Clara said finally. It's fraudulent. Stroud misrepresented the document at the time of signing. I spoke with Frank Alderman this morning before I rode out here. His daughter gave a full statement. Cross nodded. That deed is void. Stroud knows it, which is why he's been moving so fast. He looked between them. I'm placing Harold Stroud under arrest this afternoon. I'd like you both present at the bank when I do. Miss Whitfield, your documentation is going to be central to the federal case. I'll bring everything, Clara said. Cross looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who'd been doing his job long enough to recognize when someone else was very good at theirs. You found all of this in 8 days? I found the first piece in an hour, she said. The rest followed. You worked legal correspondence. 8 years. Cross picked up the payment receipt with a falsified date stamp and looked at it one more time. How many clerks in St. Joseph law offices can spot altered bank ink on a payment receipt? Not many, Clara said. I had a good reason to learn. He put the receipt down. I imagine you did. He stood, picked up his satchel, and put on his hat. 2 o'clock, Stroud's bank. He left, and James and Clara sat at the table in the silence that followed. It's real, James said. It's been real. She looked at her hands on the table. It's just finally moving in the right direction. He reached over and covered both her hands with one of his. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and he was looking at her the way he'd been looking at her for days, like a man who'd spent 3 years being careful about what he let himself want, and had recently run out of reasons to keep being careful. After this, he said. After this, she agreed. They rode into Harrow Creek at 1:45, and by the time they tied their horses in front of Stroud's bank, Marshal Cross was already there with 2 deputies Clara hadn't seen before, and Ruth McAllister was standing on the boardwalk outside her store with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who had been waiting 14 months for this specific afternoon. Stroud was at his desk when they walked in. He saw Cross's badge first, then his deputies, then James, then Clara with her satchel. And in the half-second before his face assembled itself into the pleasantness he always wore, Clara saw something she'd been waiting to see since the moment she'd walked into his office 6 days ago and laid 5 documents on his desk. She saw that he understood it was over. He stood anyway. Marshal, this is unexpected. Harold Stroud. Cross's voice was flat and official. I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, falsification of financial records, misrepresentation in a property transaction, and conspiracy to defraud multiple landowners in connection with an undisclosed financial interest in the Union Pacific Northern Corridor acquisition. He produced the warrant. You can read this here or at the jail. Your choice. Stroud looked at the warrant. He did not take it. He looked at James. You went to the federal marshal. His voice was still controlled. still pleasant, almost, over a boundary dispute. Over a pattern of fraud across 6 properties, Clara said. The boundary markers were the smallest part of it. Stroud's eyes moved to her, and they stayed there. And what was in them now was not pleasantness or calculation, but something stripped of those surfaces. A cold and direct fury at the specific fact of her. "You've been here 9 days," he said. 10, she said. "And I found it in the first hour." Something flickered. "You don't know what you've done. The railroad contract, the investors, the $40,000 you owe," Clara said. "We know about that too." The pleasantness was entirely gone. "You have no idea the kind of men involved in this arrangement. They don't—" "Mr. Stroud," Marshal Cross stepped forward. "I'd stop talking now if I were you." Stroud stopped talking. One of the deputies moved behind him, and Stroud's hands came up without being told, and the cuffs went on with a sound that was very small and very final in the quiet of the bank. The teller at the front counter had gone absolutely still, watching with the expression of a man deciding very quickly how cooperative to be with a federal investigation. Clara looked at that teller. "The payment receipt alterations," she said quietly. "The marshal will want to speak with everyone who had access to those records." The teller looked at her. "I didn't know what he was doing," he said. "Not all of it. He told me it was a standard adjustment." "Then tell the marshal that exactly as you just told me." She held his gaze. "The truth is easier than you think." They took Stroud out through the front door and across the main street to the sheriff's office, where Cross had arranged temporary holding before the transfer to Cheyenne. A small crowd had gathered, the way crowds gathered in small towns. Quietly, from a distance, pretending to be doing other things. Clara watched from the boardwalk as Cross handed Stroud off to the sheriff and stood in the street talking to his deputies, and she thought about her father, about a man who had signed a document he trusted and paid for it with everything he'd built, and about the years she'd spent learning the precise language of the thing that had destroyed him so that it could never be used against someone she cared about without her seeing it first. James came to stand beside her. His shoulder touched hers. "You all right?" "Yes." She meant it. "Are you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I've been holding something very heavy for a long time, and I just put it down." He looked at the sheriff's office. "I don't quite know what to do with my hands." Clara almost smiled. "I know the feeling." Ruth McAllister crossed the street toward them with the deliberate walk of a woman who had earned the right to arrive at things in her own time. She looked at Clara, and then at James, and then back at Clara. "Frank Alderman's daughter just came in," she said. "She's sitting in my store, and she wants to know if her father is going to get his land back." "He's going to get his land back," Clara said. "The deed transfer is void. It'll take time to process through the courts, but it'll be set aside. The marshal knows." Ruth nodded slowly. "The other 3 families who sold." She paused. "You think they had a choice?" "I think we'll find that at least some of them didn't. Cross will investigate the other transactions. If there was misrepresentation or coercion, those can be challenged." Clara looked at Ruth. "It won't be fast, but it'll move." Ruth studied her for a moment, with the particular attention of a woman who had kept records of everything that happened in a valley for 30 years and understood precisely what it meant to have things written down at the right time. "You saved this ranch," she said. "James saved it," Clara said. "He kept his original documents. He knew his own land. He knew which markers had been chiseled. I just read what was already there." "Don't do that," James said. She looked at him. "Don't make yourself smaller." His voice was quiet but direct. "You walked into that bank with 4 documents and no authority except the truth, and you made him pay back $460, and you stopped a foreclosure filing in a front yard, and you built a federal case in 8 days. Don't stand here and tell Ruth you just read what was there." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Fine. We saved it." "Better," he said. Ruth looked between them with the expression of a woman who had suspected something and had just had it confirmed. She said, "Come for dinner Sunday," and walked back to her store. They rode home in the late afternoon, and the valley was quiet around them, and the sky above the mountains was doing something extraordinary with the light, the way it did in Wyoming in November, all gold and pale blue, and the particular clarity that came before the cold settled in for the season. Clara had stopped noticing the landscape in the way she'd stopped noticing most things that weren't documents or problems to be solved. But she noticed it now. She let herself notice it. "Tell me something," James said. "What?" "When you were on the stage from St. Joseph, what did you think was going to happen?" Clara considered this honestly. "I thought I was going to arrive and find a practical man who needed practical help, and that we would build something functional and manageable, and I would have land and purpose, and stop being told my work wasn't worth a man's wage." She paused. "I did not think I was going to ride a boundary line at dawn looking for chiseled stones." "Does that bother you?" "No." She looked at the mountains. "Does it bother you that I'm not what you asked for?" "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that," he said, "if you'll let me." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with the same quality of stillness he brought to most things. But there was something different in it now. Not the closed stillness of a man who'd been alone for 3 years and intended to stay that way, but the open stillness of a man waiting for something he'd decided he wanted to hear. "James." "Yeah?" "Ask me properly." He pulled his horse up and looked at her. She stopped beside him. The valley spread out below them in the fading light, the ranch visible in the distance, with smoke coming from the chimney she'd built up before they left that morning. And it looked like something she could have drawn from imagination, except that it was real, and it was hers, if she said yes. "Clara Whitfield," James said. "I wrote a letter to an agency asking for a woman I could ignore, and you showed up and read my ledger in the first hour, and walked into Harold Stroud's bank like you owned the floor you stood on. And I have not had a single uncomplicated thought since the moment you came down that platform." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, not because of the agency arrangement, not because of the land or the winter coming or any practical reason, because you are the most capable and honest person I've met in my life, and I have been falling toward you since the moment you tore my letter in half on the platform and walked straight at me anyway." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass below them. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." Something broke open in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the guarded, almost smile she'd been cataloging for 10 days, but something full and undefended. And she thought she could spend considerable time learning all the variations of James Calloway's face when it stopped protecting itself. He reached across the space between their horses, and she met him halfway, and they kissed there, on the road above the valley, with the cold coming down, and the last of the day's light going gold. And it was nothing like any of the 17 proposals she'd declined in St. Joseph, none of which had come after riding a boundary line together in the dark, or standing shoulder to shoulder in a banker's office, or sitting up until midnight, cross-referencing land survey coordinates. When they pulled apart, he kept her hand, and they rode the last mile to the ranch like that. And Clara thought about her father, about the years she'd carried his loss like a document she couldn't put down, and felt something in her chest shift quietly into a different arrangement. The weeks that followed were not simple. Federal investigations never were. Marshal Cross returned twice with his deputies, and there were depositions and document certifications, and 2 trips to Cheyenne that Clara made herself because the case was built on her accounting, and she was not going to let someone else explain her work to a federal judge. Frank Alderman's deed transfer was voided on December 3rd, 2 days after Stroud's corridor deadline collapsed. The railroad contract dissolved. The investors in Stroud's Eastern arrangement withdrew, and the whole structure he'd spent 2 years building came down in the same quiet, methodical way that Clara had spent 10 days putting together the case against it. Stroud was convicted in February on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of misrepresentation in a property transaction. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Territorial Penitentiary, and as the verdict was read, Clara sat in the gallery of the Cheyenne courthouse with her hands in her lap and felt no satisfaction and no vindication, and nothing dramatic at all. Only the clean, finished feeling of a column of figures that had finally been corrected and could now be closed. James married her on a Saturday morning in December, 2 weeks after the corridor deadline passed, and 3 weeks after Stroud had been transferred to Cheyenne. The ceremony was in Ruth McAllister's store, because the church was too cold, and Ruth had put up pine boughs, and Frank Alderman came with his daughter, and Daniel Kerr stood as a witness, and the justice of the peace said the words in a voice that suggested he was genuinely moved, which Clara suspected was Ruth's doing. James said his vows, looking directly at her, with the full, open attention he'd been giving her since the moment she'd shown him the falsified interest rate by lamplight. And Clara said hers, looking back at him, with the same directness she brought to everything. And when it was done, Ruth produced a bottle of something that was definitely not appropriate for a Saturday morning, and everyone agreed it was. Spring came, and with it the work of building what they'd fought to keep. The barn wall James had been putting off for 2 years, a new fence line along the north boundary, with stones they set themselves, each one marked with 2 parallel chisel lines that Clara made while James held the stones steady. Frank Alderman's land was officially restored to his family in April, and James rode over to help his daughter repair the roof that had gone unmaintained through the winter of uncertainty. Clara wrote a letter to Marshall Cross in June, listing 3 other financial irregularities she'd identified in Harrow Creek's banking records while preparing the fraud case. And Cross wrote back, saying 2 of the 3 had already been flagged by his investigation, and the 3rd was new and useful, and that she was wasted in Wyoming and should consider a position with the federal marshal's office, to which she did not reply because she was standing in her own doorway, looking at her own land, and did not feel wasted at all. On a September evening, a year and 2 weeks after she'd torn a letter in half on a depot platform, Clara stood on the porch of the Callaway Ranch and watched James come up from the barn, and thought about the woman who'd packed a leather notebook and a ruler and a set of accounting pencils into a traveling bag in St. Joseph and gotten on a stage into uncertainty. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and they looked out over the valley together, the way they had looked over it countless times now. This land that had been threatened and defended and almost lost and kept, and that was theirs in the full legal and moral sense of that word. "You're thinking," he said. "Always." "What about?" She looked at him, at the face she'd learned completely, that was still capable of surprising her. "About a man who wrote a letter, asking for a woman he could ignore." She took his hand. And what would have happened to him if he'd gotten what he asked for? James's thumb moved across her hand. He would have lost everything by spring. The land, the accounts, all of it. Stroud would have had what he wanted before the first snow. Yes. And instead, he looked out over the valley. Instead, he has this. Instead, he has this, Clara said. The evening light came down across the valley, gold and long, and the mountains held their snow at the peaks, and below them the Callaway land ran green and solid to its boundaries. Every stone marker in place, every line documented, every figure in the ledger accurate and clean and honestly kept. James Callaway had asked for a woman he could ignore, and Clara Whitfield had arrived with ink-stained fingers and 8 years of hard knowledge, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, but simply moves forward. And between them, they had saved something worth saving, and built something worth having. And the land beneath them was proof of what becomes possible when a man stops asking for what he thinks he wants, and a woman refuses to be anything less than everything she is. That was the truth of it, written plainly, and it would hold.